She was only 22. Beautiful, smiling, and personally selected prisoners for the gas chambers. This is not fiction. This is history. And it's far more disturbing than we were ever taught. July 4th, 1946, Gdańsk, Poland. More than 200,000 people gathered on a grassy hill just outside the city. Below them stood 11 gallows, lined in a row, framed by a thick summer sky. On the back of military trucks, 11 bound prisoners waited for the signal. Among them were 5 young women, all under the age of 25. They weren't spectators of war. They weren't collateral damage. They were perpetrators. When the trucks rolled forward and the bodies dropped, the ropes didn't snap necks cleanly. The drops were short. The deaths came slowly, by suffocation. The crowd roared. The story of the Holocaust is often told through the names of men: Hitler, Himmler, Mengele. But buried in the shadows were the women, SS guards, who beat, humiliated, and sent thousands to their deaths with a smile. Their names faded into obscurity, their roles diminished in the retelling. Yet they were there, in Ravensbrück, in Auschwitz, in Stutthof. This is their story. It's tempting to believe that monsters are born, that cruelty is somehow coded into the DNA of killers. But history teaches us a far more unsettling truth. Monsters are made. They are trained, conditioned, and often recruited from the ranks of the ordinary. The young women who brutalized prisoners at camps like Stutthof and Bergen-Belsen didn't start out as sadists. Most were raised in average German homes. Some were farmers' daughters. Others worked as shop clerks or housemaids. Many had no prior history of violence. And yet, by war's end, they had become willing participants in a regime of unthinkable brutality. How did this happen? The answer begins with ideology. Nazi Germany's regime did not merely aim to conquer land. It sought to reshape the German soul, and that included the roles of women. From a young age, girls were taught their primary duty was to the Reich, to racial purity, and to Adolf Hitler himself. The motto was simple but powerful. Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. A woman's role was to give birth to racially pure children, to raise them with Nazi values, and to support her husband. But underneath this seemingly domestic vision was a far more dangerous message. Women were also warriors, not with rifles, but with loyalty, discipline, and belief. The indoctrination started early. Girls as young as 10 were required to join the Young Girls' League, and by 14, they moved into the League of German Girls, BDM, the female branch of Hitler Youth. Here they were taught obedience, nationalism, physical endurance, and most importantly, the idea that some lives were worth more than others. BDM camps emphasized racial superiority, emotional coldness, and devotion to the Nazi cause. These girls were raised not only to avoid compassion for Jews, Poles, or Romani, but to see them as dangerous, subhuman enemies of the state. When war erupted, Germany needed more than mothers. It needed enforcers. With thousands of men sent to the front lines, the SS began recruiting women to staff concentration camps. Some applied voluntarily, seeking pay and purpose. Others were lured by prestige or manipulated by propaganda. Training was carried out primarily at Ravensbrück, the largest women's concentration camp. There, recruits were taught how to discipline prisoners, manage camp logistics, and most chillingly, how to select inmates for execution. These weren't secret orders whispered behind closed doors. Violence was a job requirement. Women were instructed to beat prisoners who disobeyed, to report weakness, and to enforce camp discipline through humiliation and terror. Many did more than obey. They embraced the power. At Stutthof, over 100,000 prisoners passed through the gates. Jews, Poles, Soviet POWs, and political enemies of the Reich were starved, beaten, executed, or worked to death. Among the guards stood women barely out of their teens, some under 25, with polished boots and lethal authority. They patrolled the camp with dogs. They poured freezing water on naked prisoners during roll calls. They laughed as they delivered blows with sticks and whips. Some made selections, choosing which prisoners would live another day and which would be sent to the gas chambers. And, still, they braided their hair. They wore perfume. They danced in SS barracks. One female guard, Jenny-Wanda Barkmann, became known as the beautiful spectre, as deadly as she was elegant. Another, Irma Grese, only 22 at her execution, was described as smiling while choosing inmates to die. What's terrifying is not just what these women did, but how quickly they adapted to doing it. The camp system turned human beings into functionaries of death. And in that system, femininity became a weapon, not of nurture, but of obedience, ruthlessness, and silence. By the end of the war, nearly 3,700 women had served as SS guards. Some were captured and tried. Most faded into obscurity. Their crimes were overshadowed by the infamy of male Nazis. But history has not forgotten, and the evidence of their cruelty is undeniable. The next chapter reveals the worst among them. They were not born killers, but they chose to become them. And for that, they would face the ultimate punishment. She was just 22. Standing before the court in Lüneburg in 1945, Irma Grese seemed almost out of place. Her blonde hair was neatly braided, her skin youthful and clear, and her demeanor disturbingly calm. She smiled occasionally, not nervously, but as if amused. But the testimonies that followed would wipe the smile from the faces of everyone else in the courtroom. Irma had joined the SS at just 18 years old. She trained at Ravensbrück and was quickly transferred to Auschwitz, then later Bergen-Belsen. There she rose to infamy, not because of her age, but because of her eagerness. Witnesses said she carried a whip, that she used her trained dog to terrorize prisoners, that she selected victims for the gas chambers with the same detachment one might use to choose fruit at a market. One survivor recalled her laughing as a prisoner begged for mercy. Another said she walked through the barracks as if she owned the place, which, in her mind, she probably did. She became known as the hyena of Auschwitz. What shocked the world was not just her cruelty, but how normal she looked. Irma wasn't a twisted old villain in a cloak. She was young, pretty, polite, and yet she had overseen torture, humiliation, and the systematic murder of innocents. During the Belsen trial, Irma showed little remorse. She claimed she was just following orders, but the evidence said otherwise. Her role wasn't passive. She was active, proud, even enthusiastic. When she was sentenced to death, she blinked once. That was it. On December 13, 1945, Irma Grese was hanged by British executioner Albert Pierrepoint. Her last words, according to some reports, were schnell, German for quickly, and then she was gone. But Irma wasn't the only one. At Stutthof, the crimes continued, and so did the horror. Jenny-Wanda Barkmann, nicknamed the Beautiful Spectre, was another young woman who wore her SS uniform like a fashion statement. She arrived at Stutthof in 1944. With her high cheekbones and model-like appearance, some thought she was a secretary, but she quickly earned a darker reputation. Jenny was involved in selections, the deadly process of deciding who would be sent to forced labor and who would die in the gas chamber. According to survivors, she often did this with a smirk. She kicked prisoners, beat them, and when she wasn't doing that, she posed in her uniform for photos. She was barely 24 when she stood trial. On July 4, 1946, in front of a crowd of 200,000, Jenny was executed by public hanging in Gdansk, Poland. Her truck stalled beneath the gallows. causing a moment of eerie silence. Then, a former prisoner stepped forward and shoved her off. She died instantly, but her legacy, like Grese's, lived on, not in triumph, but in infamy. The cruelty didn't stop with them. Gerda Steinhoff had worked as a maid, then a tram conductor, before becoming a block leader at Stutthof. She was described as enthusiastic and diligent, but her loyalty was to death. Survivors testified that she personally beat inmates, organized selections, and showed no emotion as people were marched to their deaths. She was awarded a medal for her service by the Nazi regime. At her trial, Gerda laughed. She was found guilty and hanged alongside Barkmann. Ursula Paradis, another young woman, became known for her creative cruelty. She would pour buckets of freezing water over naked prisoners during winter and laugh as they collapsed from shock. She reportedly relished early morning roll calls, where she struck prisoners across the face with sticks. Her superiors were so impressed, they promoted her. But in 1946, she too faced justice. Then came Elizabeth Becker, one of the youngest, only 22 when she was sentenced to death. Her crime? Participating in selections, abandoning starving prisoners at sea during evacuations, and signing documents that sealed countless fates. Though some advocated for clemency, arguing she was too young, the Polish president refused. Becker was hanged beside the others. These were not rare cases. These were not anomalies. They were patterns. Each of these women had choices, and each chose cruelty. Their femininity gave them a false veil of innocence, one that history has since torn away. Because behind the perfume and smiles, behind the braids and boots, were people who knew exactly what they were doing. They chose to become instruments of terror, and when the world saw what they had done, it did not look away. Their names, their crimes, and their final moments remind us of something we can never afford to forget. Evil does not always come with fangs. Sometimes it wears lipstick. July 4, 1946, Gdańsk, Poland. It began with silence. A hill just outside the city swelled with an audience of over 200,000 people. Workers had been given the day off. Families brought picnic baskets. Soldiers guarded the perimeter. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders to see above the crowd. At the center stood a row of 11 gallows, crude, wooden, and solemn. Flatbed military trucks were positioned beneath each one. Tied with coarse rope and flanked by guards, the condemned stood atop them, staring out into the sea of spectators. 5 of the condemned were women. They were young, some barely in their 20s. Just a few years earlier, they had worn lipstick and braids, posed for photographs in SS uniforms, and laughed while handing out death sentences at Stutthof. But now their hands were bound, their legs trembled, and the crowd, a crowd that had survived Nazi occupation, waited to watch them die. There was no ceremony, no speeches, no blindfolds. When the signal was given, the trucks lurched forward, leaving the women suspended in the air. Their bodies dropped, but there was no clean snap. The ropes were short, and so they died not from broken necks, but from slow strangulation. Some kicked for several seconds. One woman cried out. 2 of them struggled with their guards, refusing to climb onto the truck beds. They had to be dragged. The crowd was not quiet. As each body swung lifelessly, the people surged forward, screaming, crying, throwing stones, and shouting curses. Some wept. Others cheered. Many tried to rip pieces of clothing or rope from the corpses as macabre souvenirs. The guards had to fire warning shots into the air to push the crowd back. One truck failed to start. Jenny-Wanda Barkmann, the infamous beautiful specter of Stutthof, stood awkwardly for a moment, the noose already around her neck. The crowd jeered. Then, in a chilling moment of poetic justice, a former prisoner ran from the crowd and shoved her off the edge. She died instantly, Their corpses were later delivered to the medical academy in Gdansk. There they were dissected and used for anatomical study, a fate once reserved for the victims they had condemned. For those watching, it was both catharsis and horror. The world had rarely seen justice carried out in such public, unflinching terms, and never before for women like these. These executions were the result of a trial that had peeled back the curtain on what had happened behind the barbed wire of Stutthof. But it wasn't the only trial. It wasn't even the first. Next came the legal reckoning at Belsen, where another set of female guards would be forced to answer for their crimes, not just in the eyes of the court, but before the witnesses who had survived them. The gallows stood empty. The ropes were slack now. The crowds had dispersed. But the air over that hill in Gdansk hung heavy, thick with the memory of what had just occurred. Justice, they said, a reckoning, retribution, and for some perhaps it was. But justice is never simple, and it is never complete. In the weeks that followed the executions of the 5 female SS guards from Stutthof, silence fell over much of Europe. Newspapers printed the names, photos were published. Yet for all the visual proof, for all the bodies hanging limp in the summer wind, the world still struggled with what it had seen. These weren't hardened warlords or bloodthirsty generals. They weren't monsters in the traditional sense. They were women, some barely past adolescence. Women who had once played piano, served in bakeries, or written diary entries about dancing and boys. And yet they had become executioners, overseers of gas chambers, enforcers of starvation, beatings, humiliation. For those who survived their cruelty, the hangings brought some measure of closure. But it was not enough to erase what had been done. The survivors returned home, if they still had one, with their memories intact. And memories, unlike rope, do not fray. They stay knotted around the mind. The trials that shook the world. Before the ropes tightened, there were courtrooms, some hastily assembled in repurposed buildings, others built specifically to process the unprecedented number of war crimes. The Belsen trial, which began in September 1945, marked one of the first major legal reckonings after the fall of Nazi Germany. Held in Lüneburg by the British Military Tribunal, it was shocking not only for its content, but for its defendants. Of the 45 individuals on trial for crimes at Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, 16 were women. Most had been SS guards or administrators. Some, like Irma Grese, were already infamous. Others, like Elisabeth Volkenrath and Juana Bormann, had quietly exerted control in the shadows until survivors named them, pointed to them, and forced the world to look. The courtroom was often tense. Survivors gave testimonies that caused translators to pause, their voices trembling. Stories of torture, starvation, whippings for amusement, selections performed with a wave of the hand, a wave that meant life or death. Some of the accused wept, others denied, and a few smirked. When Irma Grese was sentenced to death, she accepted the verdict without emotion. On the day of her execution, she reportedly said only one word, schnell. Quickly. It was the most chilling part, the casual finality of someone who had sent so many others to die without blinking. The trials served another purpose, too. They became history lessons in real time. Evidence was presented not just for justice, but for posterity. Photographs of corpses, ledgers detailing prisoner counts, blueprints of gas chambers. For the first time, the world saw in undeniable terms what the Nazi regime had built and who had helped build it. But not everyone faced the rope. Justice, though powerful, was also flawed. While some guards were tried and executed, others escaped entirely. Some simply vanished in the chaos of post-war Europe. Others assumed new identities. and some were quietly absorbed back into society. One of the most haunting examples was Herta Botha, known as the Stutthof sadist. Unlike her fellow guards, Botha was highly educated, articulate, and careful. She wielded a pistol in the camps, starved prisoners by withholding food, and once led a death march from Stutthof to Bergen-Belsen. She was eventually tried at the Belsen trial and sentenced to only 10 years in prison. She served just 6 years. In 1951, she was released and disappeared into post-war Germany under a new name. She died in 2000, a free woman. No gallows, no crowd, no closure. This wasn't an isolated case. In the 1950s and 60s, many lower-level female guards returned to ordinary lives. Some resumed work in hospitals. Others married, raised families, and were never questioned about the lives they had taken. For survivors, this was a second betrayal, not just by the SS, but by history itself. Late justice, long memory. But the reckoning did not end in the 1940s. In 2018, a 94-year-old former SS guard named Johann Rehbogen, who had worked at Stutthof, was put on trial in Germany. He was tried in juvenile court because he had been under 21 at the time of his crimes. In 2019, Bruno Day, another former Stutthof guard, was convicted at 93 for complicity in the deaths of more than 5,000 people. And in 2021, one of the most remarkable trials occurred. Irmgard Fürschner, a 96-year-old former SS secretary at Stutthof, was arrested after trying to flee on the day of her trial. She had worked directly for the camp's commandant and was charged with complicity in the murder of over 11,000 people. Despite her age and her position behind a typewriter, the court ruled that she had known everything and had enabled it to happen. The message was clear. No role was too small to escape moral responsibility. These late-life trials weren't about vengeance. They were about memory, about sending a signal that time does not erase guilt, that even a century later, evil can and will be named. What justice really means. So what does justice look like? Is it the swing of a body from a noose? Is it a courtroom with survivors testifying through translators? Is it the sight of a frail 96-year-old woman wheeled into court for crimes committed in her youth? Or is it something quieter? A footnote in a textbook, a plaque at a memorial, a YouTube documentary viewed by a teenager who never learned this in school. Justice, in its truest form, is not about punishment. It's about remembrance. It's about telling the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's unbearable. It's about looking at the face of a 22-year-old woman who smiled as she sent someone to the gas chamber, and refusing to call her anything less than what she was, a perpetrator. And it's about ensuring that the next time someone says, "It could never happen again," we have the courage to reply, "It already did." The women who hanged on the gallows in Gdansk were not just individual criminals. They were symbols of what can happen when ideology replaces empathy, when obedience replaces morality, and when hate wears a familiar face. They remind us that evil does not always arrive in jackboots and shouting speeches. Sometimes it comes with perfume, with a clipboard, with a smile. And that's why their stories matter. Because remembering them isn't just about justice for the past. It's a warning for the future. The rope had snapped. The bodies had swung. The crowds had gone home. But the silence that followed left the biggest scar. What happens when the perpetrators are gone, but the memories remain? In our final chapter, we confront the silence and what it truly means to remember.